What's up guys, welcome back. In this video we'll take a look at how I painted the leather straps on this orc backpack. When I'm painting things I usually start with the mid-tone and then add my highlights and shadows. But for this we're going to start off with the darkest colour, which we'll make by mixing a bit of black into some scale colour brown leather. And you can use any standard brown tone if you don't have that. The reason we're starting off dark here is because we're going to be adding a lot of texture to the surface, and at this scale it's a little bit tricky to add your shadows in without affecting the textures of the highlights. So we might as well just start off dark and then build layers of highlights on top. That way we won't need to worry about how we're going to add the shadows later on. I'm not going to bore you by going over painting the base coat, so we'll just skip straight to the highlighting. For that we'll begin by adding a bit of brown leather into the mix, making it slightly less dark. And we'll draw that up to the areas where we want to create our highlights. That's going to be around the edges of the belt and anywhere it's been repeatedly flexed. When you bend a leather belt it stresses the surface, and over time that creates wear and tear around those spots. So if you target those areas you usually get a better effect. You can see I'm using a pretty thin paint consistency for this. I like to work on the thin side in general because I find it a lot easier to add another layer than to take one away. Having said that, I'm not too fussed about blending anything out at this initial stage. We're going to be applying quite a lot of texture on top, so most of this will get covered up. This step is really just to help set the stage and give us something to build on. Add a bit more brown leather into the mix and we'll start to work in a bit of texture. I do this by painting on little horizontal lines across the width of each strap. This is to simulate the small hairline cracks you get on leather belts. We'll do that up here at the top as well, just painting on those little lines across the width. Again, don't worry about blending things out, the texture is going to do a lot of the work for you as you build up the layers, so don't feel you need to spend a lot of time doing this. You're just trying to create an initial impression of texture on the surface. We'll add another layer now, this time with the brown leather on its own. I'll start by building up the colour normally around those areas where the belt is flexed. Pulling the paint up across the surface from both sides, letting the paint meet in the middle at that high point where the belt comes to a little peak. It's usually a good idea to define the colour of the area first and then come back in with some texture around the edges. You'll get a much clearer effect doing it that way. And we'll do that now, adding our little lines over the top and around the edges of each highlight. And we're doing this to help mask where the highlight ends and also to create a nice subtle surface texture over the belt. This helps us build up the colour faster than if we just used the texturing technique on its own. If you were to just paint on the little lines, a lot of the times you'll end up with too much of the base colour showing through underneath, and by the end you have more of a weird stripy surface rather than something that looks warm. So it's usually a good idea to define the colour of the area first and then come back in with some texture around the edges. You'll get a much clearer effect doing it that way. We'll also start to define the edges of each strap with a little edge highlight on either side. Try and paint on more lines the closer you get to your main highlight. It's also a nice idea to throw the odd one or two lines into the darker areas of the belt so that they are sitting off all by themselves. It just adds a bit more detail and helps to stop it from looking too regimented. Over time the belts would wear slightly differently, so you don't want them all to end up looking exactly the same. Adding a bit of variation between each one is a good way to prevent that. We'll move on to our highlight now, and for that we'll use some of this Mars orange which we'll mix straight into the brown leather. Colour theory wise, brown lies in this area here around the red-orange through to yellow-orange spectrum. It's a very strange colour because there are many ways that you can make it. So for example you can mix equal parts of two complementary colours, so red and green or yellow and purple. Or you can mix equal parts of red, blue and yellow, or equal parts cyan, magenta and yellow, or even by simply mixing black into orange. There's also many ways that you can vary the look. For example, you can pull it towards different colours just by mixing a bit of that colour into it, resulting in many different variations, but they're all still essentially brown. So that you don't get confused, rather than pondering all the different variations, I find it helps to think of brown as simply a dark orange. And when I'm painting, I usually try and use a more saturated version of whatever colour I'm using for my initial highlights. So because we know this brown is essentially a dark orange, we're going to use a saturated orange to highlight it, and that's why I've chosen the Mars orange. You don't want to paint orange straight out of the pot because it would be too stark. So instead we're going to create an intermediate step by mixing it into the brown so that we can introduce the colour gradually. That way there's not going to be such a violent shift between the brown and the bright orange. We'll paint this on much like the previous layers, but we'll start to be a lot more deliberate and careful with what we're doing. I'm going to focus much more on the parts of the belt where it's being bent to create more wear and tear on those spots. I'll also pick out the edges, and I'll do that with little broken dots rather than a solid line. Using dots there creates the illusion of a frayed edge, because it gives you that play between the dark and light, and your eyes read it as surface texture rather than little dots of paint. Mix some more of the Mars orange into the highlight and we'll keep building up the textures. Again, focusing on the high points where the belt is being flexed. Try not to cover up all the work from the previous layers when you're doing this. You want to keep your lines quite small and controlled. You can see that using the orange gives quite a nice effect. If you were just to add white or an off-white into the brown, you'd end up with a very desaturated brown for your highlights. You can actually use that approach, but you'll need to go back in and do some extra work to stop it from looking flat and boring. You can check out one of my leather videos from the Aaron series to see a good way to handle that approach. Add some more Mars orange into the mix and we'll add another layer of our texture. Again, focus most of your attention on those high points. You can see the effect starting to come through now. I think it's really cool the way all the different layers build up on each other and give you this realistic texture. For our next highlight, we want to lighten the orange, but we don't want to just add white or an off-white to it because that will result in a very bright orange, which would make our highlights look a bit silly. If you look at this colour wheel, you can see that yellow is brighter than orange, so we can use that to lighten it. However, we don't want to use a saturated yellow because, again, we're going to end up in the same situation with very bright orange highlights. So instead we'll use a yellow that has way less saturation. Ideally, you want to reuse colours you've already used elsewhere on the model, where possible. With that in mind, I'm going to use some English Uniform, which is a pretty desaturated yellow ochre. Now, if you compare the two, you'll see that the English Uniform is actually quite a bit darker than the Mars Orange. So before we use it, we're simply going to lighten it by mixing in a bit of scale colour white sands, making it brighter. And we can then mix that into the orange to lighten it, which gives us a really nice highlight colour to work with. We'll paint this on just like the previous layers, using little lines and dots to build up the texture around those worn areas. If you want, you can throw in some extra little scratches here and there. Just be careful that you don't overdo it. Remember, you're working on quite a small scale here, so if you add too many, it'll end up looking a bit of a mess because your eyes won't be able to tell what's going on. For the next highlight, we're going to mix in a bit more of that lightened English Uniform, and we'll just emphasise the last step, adding very small highlights using our previous layer as a guide. So each layer you add really works as a map for where you place your next layer of highlights. You're not really painting your lines and dots on blindly. You're looking at the marks on the surface from the previous layer and trying to embellish them with slightly smaller highlights to help bring out all the little details that are already there. So it's only really your first layer or two of texture that's going to feel random. However, once we paint the buckles, the highlights on the belt actually appear to fade slightly. That's because the buckles are much brighter in comparison, so it changes the look of the leather. To fix that, we'll simply add another layer to the leather, this time a bit brighter. And we'll do that by mixing in some white sands into the highlight to brighten it. and then we'll apply that as little dots just at the very edge of all the little worn areas and scratches. When you're painting a section at a time, often when you finish a new area, it's going to change the look of another one, so don't be too worried about that. You can always go back and add some corrections to parts that you thought were finished. I tend to do that quite a lot. It's actually quite good practice to re-evaluate the model every time that you finish a new area. It can help your understanding of how colour works, and it's quite fun to see an area change without actually altering it, just by painting in the surrounding elements. You can add some tiny little dots here and there on the surface too if you're feeling brave. But again, try not to get carried away with that, or you're going to end up with too much detail for the eye to take in, and it'll just end up looking messy. Alright, so I think that's balanced out quite well now. Thanks as always for your support, and I hope you're getting on okay. Thanks again. Bye for now.